In this video, we'll talk about a very useful shortcut in writing out truth tables, and we'll also explore why it makes sense that arguments that always have false premises are valid arguments. Now, in this chapter, we learn how to do the following. We made a table with the propositions that we're considering and the simple propositions that go into those that make them up. And remember, our connectives here are truth functional connectives. So when we wrote out these tables, we put together all the possible truth value combinations for those simple propositions. And then when we looked over at the propositions that they make up, we had these rules for the connectives that told us what the big propositions, what their truth values would be given the truth values of the simple propositions. And we use the results to check and see if there's ever a place, if there's ever a combination of truth values for those simple propositions where all of the propositions that we're considering come out true. If there's at least one line on this truth table where they all come out true. And to be honest, I'm not really sure why our author here, Nicholas Smith, decided to reveal this right now, but we can also use this to check for the validity of an argument. So we could list out all of our propositions here, and we could also include a conclusion here, and then look at this as one big argument that we're giving. And then the strategy would be to again, list out all the possible combinations for the simple propositions that make up our premises and conclusion, and then check and see for every line on our truth table, for every possible combination of the simple proposition, is it the case that we ever have all premises true and the conclusion false? If that's the case, then we know we have an invalid argument, right? We know that there's a place where we have all true premises and a false conclusion. We can't say just based on the structure of this argument that we know that given the premises, if they're all true, then the conclusion has to be true, right? We don't get that. But since we listed out every possible combination of these simple propositions for their truth values, then we know we've looked at every possibility for the propositions in our argument here. So if we look through every line and we see that we never have a line that is a counterexample, we never have a line where all the premises are true and the conclusion is false, then we know that this argument must be valid. So we can actually use this strategy here and figure out whether or not our arguments are valid. But now think about that. The only way for our argument to be invalid is to have all true premises and a false conclusion. Well, I think one thing that's confusing here in logic is that the definitions are strict. And what I mean by that is they go both ways. So if being invalid means having true premises and a false conclusion, that means if you have at least one false premise in that line, then that line can't be a counterexample. It can't be a line where you have all true premises, false conclusion. If that line is a place where the conclusion is true, then also you can't have that be a counterexample, right? It can't be a place where you have all true premises, false conclusion. It can't be one of those kinds of rows. So really, we have two facts here that we can use to our advantage to make some shortcuts as Smith does in the book. So given that knowledge, here's the strategy. Set up a truth table like we normally do, right? So you have the simple propositions all listed out with their different possible combinations of truth values. You have the propositions that we really care about in the argument. We set one of them up as the conclusion, right? And I like to put a little box around it so I know that's the conclusion, but it's the one on the end, so that if that helps. And then we look for the simplest of these propositions here. And in this case, it would be the conclusion, the not P. And when I see that not P, that's easy to do, right? First, I take all the truth values from the P column, and then I just flip them for the not P. That's easy to do. And when I do that, I see that half of these are places where the conclusion is true and half of them are places where the conclusion is false. Well, remember, the only kind of counterexample you can have is where all the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So in those places where the conclusion is true, I just won't keep doing the truth table there. I know those can't be counterexamples, right? So I'm only going to worry about those other places where the conclusion is false. And then I'm going to look at the next least complicated proposition. And in this case, that would be not P or Q. Now I've already figured out what the values for not P are here, right? So now I just throw on the Q's there too. And then I do my disjunction where, disjunction is only false when both disjuncts are false, true otherwise. And then I see some places where this disjunction turns out true, some places where it turns out false. But again, remember, the only way for me to get a counterexample is to have true premises, false conclusion. So in the places where I have a false premise, I'm just going to delete those lines. I'm not going to worry about those lines. Or if you want to, scratch out those lines or whatever you want to do. And then I'll go to the next proposition. And the next proposition is a lot more complicated, but I'll just fill that out like I normally do. And then once I've got that filled out, I'll just check, is there a place where this one is true? And now if this one is true in any of these lines, the moment I get to a true here, I know that my other proposition here, my other premise I should say, is true. I know that my conclusion is false because those are the only ones I'm considering here. So if I ever get it true on this one, I'm just going to stop right there and say counterexample, this is an invalid argument. If, however, I don't ever get it true here, that doesn't mean that this proposition can never be true. That means that whenever I have the proposition, my first premise here, true, and the conclusion is false, this proposition itself can't be true. So I have a valid argument. So in other words, all we're doing here is we're just taking out lines that can't be invalid lines without having to go through the rigmarole of actually checking out every single connective and how it affects every single place. So there is our strategy, and it's a very useful one, and it helps us to see if our argument is valid without having to do too much work. But you may wonder, why are we checking for validity in the first place? What's the whole point of this validity thing? Well, remember, validity, all it means, and this is what we're checking for, all it means is that given the structure of your argument, doesn't matter what the argument actually says, but given the structure of it, you'll never have true premises and a false conclusion. In other words, if all the premises are true, you'll know that the conclusion is also true. Now, what does that give us? Does that prove to us that the conclusion is true? Does that mean that we have true premises? No, it doesn't mean that. All it means that is if you have true premises, then you will have a true conclusion. It doesn't say that you have true premises. That's something that you're going to have to figure out outside of logic, unless you have tautologies for your premises, but that's a different story. Don't worry about that just yet. So it's something that is nice. It guarantees us a true conclusion once we go and do the work and see if our premises are true. But that's the extent of logic there. That's what it does for us. Knowing that validity doesn't mean that our conclusion is necessarily true. That gives us a few interesting details, because when you hear that validity, it just sounds positive, right? So it sounds like something you want. So it sounds like, oh, that must be giving me everything that I want, but not necessarily. So here are a few things to note that Smith points out at the end of this chapter here. Number one, an argument can be valid but have false premises and a false conclusion. So given his example of S is snow is white and G is grass is green, I believe, look at this argument here. It says it's not the case that snow is white and it's not the case that grass is green. Therefore, it's not the case that either snow is white or grass is green. Okay, we know that those premises are false. We know snow is white and we know grass is green. But that doesn't mean that this argument is invalid. All that means is that if these premises are true, then we know that the conclusion is also going to be true. So just let's fill it out super quick. It's not a big deal. We'll just flip the T's and F's for that not S and that not G. The S or G going to be only false when both S and G are both false. Otherwise, it's true. And then that not is just going to flip all the T's and the F's. And ultimately, we look and we don't see any rows where we have true premises and a false conclusion. So this is a valid argument. It's just that it's not true, right? It's not, the premises are not true and the conclusion is not true. That's okay. It was valid. If they were true, we would have had a true conclusion, but they're not true. A second thing to note is that you could have true premises, a true conclusion, and yet have an invalid argument. Now, checking out this argument, S, therefore S and G, all we really need to do is fill out that conjunction there, and the conjunction is only true when both conjuncts are true, otherwise it's false. Now, if S were true and G were false, we would have a true premise and a false conclusion, or all true premises, I should say, and a false conclusion. So S does not prove S and G. But we happen to know that S and G is true, right? We happen to know that S is true and we happen to know that G is true. So we happen to know that we're on line 1 here. But remember, when we're doing logic, we're looking at structure. We're looking only at just S's and G's, not snow is white and grass is green. We're not filling those details out right now. So it could be the case that this G stood for, gumballs are gross and gumballs are actually delicious. That would be a case where S is true and G is false. Same structure here. So in other words, based on the structure, we don't want to conclude S and G necessarily. But we happen to know that S is true and G is true, so we happen to know that S and G is true. But that's separate. This argument doesn't prove it. A third weird thing to note here is that if the conclusion is a tautology, then the argument is automatically valid. And why is that? Remember, the only way to get a counterexample, the only way for an argument to be invalid, is to have all true premises and a false conclusion. But a tautology is always true. So you'll never have a false conclusion in that case. So for example, S, therefore if G, then G. Now if G, then G, the only way for that to be false is for the antecedent to be true and the consequent to be false. But G can't be both true and false. That doesn't work in our classical logic here. So that's just always going to be true. But notice, kind of weird, right? I mean, S and if G, then G have nothing to do with each other. So, you may wonder, why is this a valid argument? But again, only a valid argument because you never have it be invalid. So, and you may wonder, like, well, why would we have a system that does this kind of stuff? And that's a little bit more complicated of a question. But what we really want to do here is just to be sure that, given these premises, I'm going to get my conclusion, right? And without having to think about anything, just to say, like, I got these premises, I have this conclusion. Here's a case where that happens. We'll call it valid, but we're going to have to note in our minds here that doesn't mean that these two propositions are related in any way. That just means that you're going to get your conclusion as long as your premises are true. You might get your conclusion if your premises are false. Who knows? And the final thing to note that's weird is that if your premises are an unsatisfiable set, then it's going to be a valid argument. Again, weird to note. But once again, validity is all about having all true premises. You got to have a true conclusion, right? So we're just looking here to see if you're ever going to have all true premises and a false conclusion. If you do, that's invalid. Otherwise, it's valid. But if it's an unsatisfiable set, you're never going to have all the premises be true on any of these rows, right? So for example, S, not S, therefore G. When I fill out this truth table, I see that there's never a row where my premises are all true and my conclusion is false. So I'll never have to worry about that situation. I'll never have to think like, well, what if S is true and not S is true? Do I have G? I don't know. It's still a valid argument. Doesn't mean you got your conclusion, right? Doesn't mean your conclusion is true. All it means is that you're never going to be deceived. You're never going to see your premises be true and then have your conclusion be false. So you know that this argument is valid, even though it doesn't really matter because you're never going to have S and not S. So those are some weird things to note about validity. Again, it's hard to keep in your mind, like, this is what we mean by valid. We don't mean that we get our conclusion. We just mean we'll never have true premises, false conclusion. That's all we mean. So given that, let's go ahead and go into the next chapter. For next time, please read the beginning part of chapter 5, 5.1, abstracting from content, and please do 5.1.1, the exercises. And I'll see you in the next chapter.